Hey everybody, welcome back to Beyond Profit Global Perspective. I'm Mark, and I want to wish you a happy World Trade Day. Now, technically, yesterday was World Trade Day, and I was at a presentation at the Nerman Museum for Contemporary Art, and at this place they had a panel where customs brokers were talking about the challenges of trade in the middle of Tariff Madness that's been going on really since the beginning of the year. How can companies handle this sort of moment of insecurity and sort of the unknown, like what to do next? And whereas I'm not a customs broker, I'm not an expert at that particularly, but the people I watched were, and I think there were some interesting takeaways. So I thought I might take a few minutes and share a little bit about what I learned. So let's do it. Before we get started, I wanted to invite you to subscribe to the channel, like the video, share the video. This is going to be a little bit more of a casual discussion. A lot of times when I have conversations like this, as you know, it might be partly me talking to you, partly me teaching a class. This is going to be a little bit different because I'm just going to share with you a few things that I learned from this thing that I went to here recently. So let me tell you a little bit more about that. I am not a customs broker myself, and that is not really my area of expertise. I know a lot about international trade, I teach global management, I've got a lot of expertise, lots of areas, but the sorts of things that these guys do, it's very in the weeds, very specific. I mean, they're not just people talking about how global trade works in general at some macro level, right? These are the guys who have business clients, and those clients have made something in China, for example, and they're going to move it into the United States, and these guys are going to figure out how to make it happen for them, make sure that it's legal, that all the paperwork is in, that their interests are best served. And so what's interesting about this is that these guys aren't really, talking about trade in the abstract, right? They're talking about like really moving products. They understand that when tariffs happen, right, they are immediately seeing the consequences of that. They really are the experts. And so I want to tell you the names of the people who spoke that day. You can look them up, who knows, reach out to them, I guess, if you're interested in more information. I'm sure there's loads of customs brokers who could probably give similar information and insights, but these guys were really sharp. One of the guys' names was Michael Salerno. He's the Vice President of International Banking for FNBO. Jay Devers also was a panelist. He is the President and Managing Partner of Bestway International. Greg Tompsett is the Senior Vice President of U.S. Customs for Kuehne+Nagel. And the facilitator was Laurie Pieper, who is the Assistant Director for Global Resources for the Kansas Department of Commerce. So some pretty heavy hitters as far as people who really know what they're talking about. So what I'm going to share with you is sort of what I got out of this conversation. It's not a summary of what each person said, but just sort of some general impressions. So one of the first things that they were talking about were some of the problems that are associated with the change in tariff structure. I'm sure you probably know if you're watching this video, when Donald Trump was reelected, became president, tariffs became a really key aspect of his economic policy, and they were radically changed almost overnight. Anything that governed U.S. trade, including World Trade Organization rules or anything regarding a free trade agreement, was sort of thrown in flux as flat tariffs were put on different countries in different ways. Some countries, they were 10%, in some cases 25%. In China, it's as high as 145%. And I'm saying that, of course, keeping in mind that right now it is May the 8th, 2025, and we still don't know exactly how things are going to go. I mean, things change from day to day. Every now and then, President Trump decides that he's going to increase tariffs. Another day, it's going to be there's an exemption for the auto industry or for this particular product. And so anything I say today could be easily undone within days or weeks. I mean, even just today, there was an agreement announced with Britain for some facilitation of trade, right? So Britain is agreeing to fast track certain U.S. products. It's not clear exactly what America is offering in this, I guess, at this point. It's still sort of early on. Of course, I would caution any of my viewers that just because one says that a deal is struck doesn't necessarily mean that things are going to go through. Just because things are fast-tracked doesn't necessarily mean that we have the industrial capacity to produce those things. So, a lot of times these bilateral deals sound good, but they aren't necessarily, they don't necessarily come to fruition in the way that everybody thinks. But it seems to be promising anyway, in that some of those, there seems to be maybe some lightening up, at least on that particular issue. And the other thing is that the British counterpart basically admitted that it's likely that the 10% flat tariffs on most products coming out of Britain would probably continue on. And we don't know yet exactly what their response would be to the fact that the United States now has 10% tariffs pretty much across the board, except with a few of those exceptions that came in the trade deal. So there's some aspects of it that are going to continue to go on as is. So that's kind of a picture of where we are in terms of trade, which was not a point of discussion yesterday, but I think just to sort of set it up, because some of these people were talking about the problems with tariffs, and they're looking at this at a much more granular level, right? So some of the problems include, like, what's going to happen to the labor market as a result of tariffs. And they were sort of cautiously optimistic, right? Like, they are kind of expecting the worst, but hoping that things are going to be, like, okay. One of them clearly said that, like, when you put 145% tariffs on a country that produces so many goods going to the United States, then it's absolutely going to have an impact on that. Already we see, markedly fewer container ships coming into ports in different places along the West Coast. That, of course, is going to lead to a decline in terms of the sorts of jobs that support those facilities, certainly shipping-oriented jobs, stuff involving truck drivers. And, as these products stop coming over, it's going to support a lot less of those kinds of jobs. To what extent that's going to happen, hard to say, obviously, at this point, but that was clearly a concern. And of course, shortages may come about as well, right? Because as these people try to figure out how to handle this problem, then it may mean that just not only is there going to be less demand for stuff coming from different countries, but just trying to manage, how fast it goes through and at what point people can afford to bring it through in order to pay these high tariffs. And that's one reason why people argue that this may all lead to inflation, because as we know, in terms of supply and demand, I think I've got my little chart over here, more of something there is in an economy, the more the prices tend to stabilize or go down, right? The more that, or the less there is of something in the economy, then the more those prices tend to go up. And so if we end up with fewer things coming across, fewer items on the shelf, they're going to be in higher demand, which means that people have these companies that produce it, the big box stores and so on, are going to raise their prices and generally make things more expensive. Now, I could be wrong. Obviously, you look at things economically, sometimes things don't turn out like you expect, but that would be probably the general prediction as far as what kinds of problems that we have. And if there's less stuff to be sold, then that could promote a recession and create even fewer jobs in terms of people who are involved in the stores who are making the jobs, or I should say selling the products. The other thing to keep in mind is that even if we start manufacturing more stuff here in the United States, which is definitely not a short-term proposition, right? This is a long-term sort of strategy, assuming that it goes through like Donald Trump hopes it's going to go through. The challenge with that is that we will not be able to manufacture everything we need, right? We are still always going to be dependent on some other countries to produce certain things. And when you're talking about a single component or a single product, that's one thing, but there are many businesses, especially small businesses, that rely on different components coming from different countries. And the problem that they may face, and this is the same problem that many of them faced during the first Trump presidency when we had tariffs on a lot of things, raw materials and so on, was the cost that it took from those producers to get those components to make the things that they need. And as prices rise, or as these components become less available, those companies that make those products and have to sell them, those that are living, like working right here in the United States, it becomes harder for them to sell, and it becomes more expensive for them to sell, which, again, supply and demand means that probably fewer people are going to buy them because they're just more expensive. And again, that tends to create a drag on the economy and also tends to put small businesses out of business. Other problems that the panel spoke to are a little more technical in nature, and they really have to do more with sort of what happens, how do these companies manage this. So one problem is kind of trying to determine what a country of origin is. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, a country of origin is technically where this product came from. Now, that's a very difficult question to figure out if you have a product that is, some components come from this country, other components come from this country, it's assembled in this country. What percentage of all of that, how does that work out? And there's different approaches to this, right? But right now there's a sort of single approach to that, but it's become extremely complicated with the kinds of tariffs that are out there now. Because if you're looking at things and you're saying, okay, well, this part came from China, but this part over here came from another part of the world, and this came from another part of the world, how do you levy those tariffs on sort of a derivative, a composite product? And that becomes even more difficult with raw materials, right? How do you break all of this down? And how do you tax it accurately? And so one of the challenges that companies are faced with is trying to figure out, what is my cost actually going to be, and how is that going to be assessed? So how do businesses deal with this problem? One of the first pieces of advice they offered is that businesses need to diversify their supply chain, right? If you're getting most of your stuff from one country, and then the administration says, all of a sudden, hey, there's an increased tariff, or there's a new tariff here or something, then not relying on that country and being able to flexibly shift to other parts of the supply chain, to other sources, is an advantage for you. And I would argue, I don't think this came up yesterday, but I would argue that's probably gives a disproportionate advantage to those businesses that are among the largest in the world, right? Those are the ones who already have large established supply chains where they can probably move a little more easily and flexibly. They have the resources to be able to do that, and so on. If you are a smaller business and you are importing, you may just get your stuff from one or two places. And if that place ends up being the target of tariffs, then it's going to be much more difficult for you to find a supplier to do something someplace else. Another thing they mentioned was scenario planning. And what they mean by that is, are you prepared for a lot of different possible situations that may happen? Again, it comes down to flexibility and maybe diversification, but there are a lot of moving parts in this sort of thing. One of the people talked about a business that really felt like it was between a rock and a hard space. So they were basically, you got a boat, your material's out on a boat there in the ocean, you're waiting for it to get to port, and you're sitting here wondering, okay, like how much in tariffs am I going to have to pay, and how am I going to handle this? Because in this specific situation, there was this person signed a contract with one of the big box stores and is planning on delivering all of this product. And while the boat was at sea, that's when all this stuff went down. And so the price and all the conditions that they promised were based on whatever happened while we still had the old rates going on. And so basically what they said is that if they don't deliver to the box store, they're going to be out of business. But based on the size of the tariff, and this was one that was shipping from China, they pay the tariff, they're going to be out of business. And so that's a really rough place for them to be in. So if you're a business like that and you're getting squeezed, how do you handle that? One question is, do you delay delivery of that shipment? So whereas when you had a free trade system, you could just let your stuff go through, the tariff system was simpler, and much more predictable, and so you knew what was going to happen, and so you just kind of you went through the process. But and likewise, the idea of sort of diverting or storing some of your product at other places would be really kind of unthinkable. Now what they're thinking about is, okay, so this is the cost of the tariff. How much would it cost me to store the stuff someplace else before bringing it into the United States, and then deciding at what point might it be a good idea to bring it in? At that point, you're thinking about maybe, exchange rates, other variables, or simply just, what can I afford this month? And is the cost of the storage going to exceed the amount in the tariff? And if the tariff is too expensive, then, geez, I mean, it might just be more worth it to sort of store it someplace. And then what that might do is then buy you time. So you got to think about it like, okay, so is it possible for me to, instead of bringing into the United States and pay a big tariff for this, try to find some other place that I can sell this stuff? So maybe I'll stash it for a while and then move it someplace else. And if that happens, obviously we've talked about the macroeconomic implications of it, right? That means that we've got fewer products on the shelf and inflation and potential job loss and all that. But for that company, that might be one way to try to strategically handle that situation. The other thing they recommended was basically forms of insurance, getting a letter of credit, spending the $400 to make that happen, making sure that you are locking in your prices ahead of time and just doing your best as far as trying to manage the sort of the legal cover yourself procedural end of things. And again, like I said, those particular issues are ones where I would recommend that if you want to know more about that, you talk to customs brokers about that. But that's another thing they said that was really important as far as how businesses need to manage the situation. A question that was brought up toward the end of the presentation is this the new normal? Or what is normal? And I think the panelists got a good laugh out of that. They're like, well, who knows, right? If you want to know what's going on, you might be best off just following Truth Social and seeing what President Trump tweets next about what his feelings are about this. But there are some things that they say, they're kind of hoping for anyway. One of the panelists said that maybe what we're seeing here in terms of America's relationship with, say, Canada and Mexico is sort of a spat, right? We've had this free trade agreement since the early 1990s. This is a marriage of sorts. We look at it a little bit like a spat. Sure, maybe it's a low point in the relationship, but it might bounce back. And I would extend that argument by saying that it is possible that many of our other relationships might snap back as well. Some of our allies, I feel anyway, may be trying to patiently wait through the Trump administration, which is sort of what happened last time around. It is anybody's guess as to how permanent some of these things are, or how much damage happens to a relationship when it's sort of really, really pushed hard. It's probably different, though, in terms of China, right? China had been abusive in many of its trade practices for a number of years. In terms of intellectual property, they were not helpful whatsoever. Even in some cases, not only demanding sensitive U.S. information from companies that wanted to do business there, but also arguably stealing some technology too. I mean, there was a lot of abuse going on. And when you are thinking about national security and looking at trade relationships in terms of potential threats, that's a different way of looking at it, right? I mean, when China joined the World Trade Organization, the United States had an attitude that, well, maybe these different different political leadership, the different policies, the different government type of countries like China, it doesn't matter. And maybe there are opportunities for internal transformation as free trade goes on. And I think there's some evidence of that happening throughout the world, where there does tend to be some liberalization when you engage in free trade. However, that certainly isn't universal, and it certainly hasn't been the case in terms of China. And so, if you're looking at this as a national security challenge, how much do you want to pull back? How much do you want to trade? I think that's going to be a more consistent question kind of going in the future as far as how the United States interacts with China. And it isn't maybe an unhealthy approach. It's, if you're talking about China making toys and selling them to the United States, I'm not exactly sure that there's a national security threat to that, right? But if you're talking about sharing technology that could be highly sensitive, or some sorts of minerals or materials that are considered to be strategic, then maybe we need to look a little more closely at some of those things. And so I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all approach to this, but I do think that free trade, relatively free-ish trade with China, anyway, freer than it is now, is probably not coming back. And so, if I were to advise businesses, I'd probably say, go diversify your supply chain, just like these other experts say. Go find other places maybe to do business. There may be some further opportunities in China, but I think that may just start closing up a little bit more in the future. So I want to thank everybody for listening. I hope you found this conversation useful and you might have learned something. If so, please subscribe to the channel, share the video, like the video. I hope you enjoyed World Trade Day. Happy trading.